Let's back up a little bit now into the 1950s in our quest to learn the background of the youth culture that flourished during the 1960s and became, in fact, the counterculture. Let me begin by saying that the mainstream, particularly white culture, with its emergence of the middle class, was, for the most part, fairly conformist, fairly corporate, fairly organizational and bureaucratic. The cultural icons of the time tended to be religious figures, business figures, a few sports figures, some music figures, but not nearly as much as you may think, and the so-called common man, and I do mean man, who ended up being a husband to a family trying to make a good life for themselves in the suburbs. Now, this was a cultural ideal. This was a retreat from the cultural idealism of the mid-1940s and the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. But by 1952, what could have turned into a much more egalitarian society became dominated by an American dream that had a small house with a small family in a comfortable suburb of a major metropolitan area. Now, this is not to say that everybody lived this way. This is to say that many people did live this way, and many more people wanted to live this way. This was also the cultural iconography that was pushed forward by television, radio, newspapers, and mass circulation magazines. Toward the end of the 1950s, actually, not really toward the end, but during the 1950s, there were other cultures. There were ethnic cultures, and among the white mainstream culture, there was a subterranean culture, a youth culture in which young adults, sometimes very young, began to respond to this conformity in the 1950s. Young kids were becoming boomers, the baby boomers about whom we've spoken before, began to become teenagers in the later part of the 1950s. And from about mid-1950s on, there started to be recognizable signs of youthful rebellion and rebelliousness among white suburban kids, in large part because people were substantially more prosperous, and with prosperity and a middle class lifestyle came the ability to extend adolescence into the late teens and even into the early 20s. Kids didn't have to go out at 15 and 16 and get work. They didn't have to leave home. They were able to stick around. And you see a lot of rebelliousness. Young adults are rebellious anyway. They're trying to establish their own identity in the world, and they're trying to establish their own culture. Winston Churchill once said that if a person is not a socialist in their 20s, they have no heart, and if they're not a conservative in their 50s, they have no brain. You can read that a number of different ways, but one of the ways that that occurs to me is to say that when they're in their 20s, young people, even before, can only imagine the kind of world that they would create. And so in imagining this world and in attempting to figure out how to create the world, they have to act within the confines of the world established by their parents and grandparents. By the time they're in their 50s, they have had an opportunity to become the power brokers and to have established, at least in part, some of the world they imagined in their 20s. Consequently, they become conservative in that they have a tremendous vested interest in the world that they have established. And the baby boomers were becoming teenagers and beginning to think about what kind of world they wanted to establish beginning in the late 19 teens. And so they became rebellious because they could become rebellious, but rebellious in a way that the lost generation of the immediate aftermath of World War I and with the Great Depression, two different generations could not really imagine. We see an emergence of a culture of rebelliousness. Instead of the flapper and the bootlegger, we see the juvenile delinquent become both a scary thing to adults and something to be emulated. We see the DA haircut of James Dean and other film stars, that haircut that flips up in the back. It's a very long hairstyle, which had not been popular during the war years. Leather jackets became very popular, as well as did blue jeans, then called chinos. And so juvenile delinquency became kind of a cultural meme of the 1950s. It was perceived as a problem, so much so that Estes Kefauver held senatorial hearings on juvenile delinquency and the impact of comic books on juveniles. But nevertheless, the rates of juvenile delinquency remained steady. However, the perception of juvenile delinquency increased. And this youthful, rebellious culture found expression in a number of other ways, mostly in music. And we see the birth in the 1950s of a new style of mainstream music. That's what's important here, the mainstreaming of rock and roll music. This was African-American music absorbed into a white youth culture and commercialized by people like the original DJ of rock and roll, Alan Freed, who coined the term rock and roll. And he was ultimately involved in what's called the Payola Scandal that almost got Dick Clark as well, who just died recently. The Payola Scandal was a scandal in which record promoters went to Alan Freed and paid him under the table in order to entice him into playing the records that they represented. Elvis Presley made rock and roll acceptable to white audiences, maybe not the parents of white kids, but white kids who would have very little exposure to or even truck with black music coming out of the black community, then saw Elvis Presley, who did have deep roots in the African-American community of Memphis and of northern Mississippi, and could imitate the kind of music that African Americans were putting out and could commercialize it to a white audience. Elvis Presley was drafted into the Army in 1957, and he faded from the scene for two or 3 years. And during that period of time, a lot of other commercialized artists like Pat Boone, for example, and others, white-breaded rock and roll, and it just about died until the British invasion of the early 1960s rescued rock and roll music from folk music and from commercialization. This kind of music was blues-based, British working-class urban music put out by people like, yes, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, other groups you're familiar with, the Kinks, the Who, and dozens of other groups, that some of which had commercial success, some of which were only commercially successful and were not really part of British invasion, and others of which you did not hear of because they enjoyed no commercial success, but did keep rock and roll from being absorbed by folk or completely commercialized into pop music. Rock and roll music was promoted by television programs like American Bandstand and by variety programs like Ed Sullivan. Eventually, however, rock music took on a life of its own, and rather than it begging for a seat at the table, commercializers and promoters were begging to get on this bandwagon of tremendous sales of LPs. I know a lot of you don't know what LPs are. Record albums and 45 singles, the 45 RPM singles. Tremendous market in that. Along with the rise of rock and roll, particularly after the 1960s, came pop music, and this could be anybody from the Kingston Trio, who were kind of folky but poppy, through Pat Boone, into Lawrence Welk. Eventually, Lawrence Welk's program started playing pop music, including a very bizarre rendition of a drug-oriented song after 1970 called One Toke Over the Line. It's hysterical. Look it up on YouTube. Folk music became, American folk became a very important genre, particularly as a set of protest songs. They harken back, for example, Bob Dylan, one of the most important of the folk singers until the mid-'60s when he switched over to electric music, much to the chagrin of many of his fans, harkened back to Woody Guthrie and the protest music of that great 1930s working class troubadour who wrote on his guitar, "This machine kills fascists." Other people, Joan Baez, and then there's a whole raft of other folk music artists that inspired and played at many of the protests. In fact, Joan Baez and Judy Collins, there's a relatively famous photograph of them at the Selma to Montgomery March, were folk musicians of the time. And folk music became part and parcel of protest music, which was part and parcel of both the New Left and the anti-war movement. But before we get there, however, let's look at some of the quote-unquote high culture of this youth movement, particularly the literary culture of this youth movement. And to do that, we have to talk about the beats or beatniks. The last syllable "nick" is something that is a pejorative added on to any other word by people in power during that period of time who wanted to taint things they disagreed with by making them vaguely communist. The syllable "nick" comes from the Russian, meaning used it like we use the syllable as in a runner or a writer or something like that. They use the syllable to mean exactly the same thing, one who does. And so it tainted the recipient with that little vague patina of pro-communism, which was so anathema during the 1950s and even later. Nevertheless, the beatniks, who never called themselves beatniks, they called themselves the Beats, did not wander around San Francisco in a marijuana haze. Well, they did, but not in black turtlenecks, wearing black sunglasses and wearing black berets, beating on bongo drums and reciting oddball poetry. No, these guys wrote oddball poetry, and it was visceral and it was very different. They were a subculture of the anti-corporate writers and intelligentsia of the time, and they made a tremendous impression on not only later writers, but on the culture itself, the subculture of what would become called the counterculture. Icons like Neil Cassidy, who would, during the subculture days, drive the Grateful Dead's bus and Ken Kesey's bus of the Merry Pranksters. The bus's name was Further, and I'll show you a picture of that in the next lecture. William Burroughs, a junkie writer who accidentally shot his wife in a heroin-induced haze. Accidentally meaning, yeah, he pointed the gun at her and pulled the trigger, but he didn't really mean to kill her. Wrote Naked Lunch in 1957. Jack Kerouac, probably the best known now of the writers of the Beat generation, wrote On the Road in 1951, but it took until 1959 to get it published. Truman Capote's after 1959, his comment, his critique of On the Road was, that's not writing, that's typing. And in fact, Kerouac wrote On the Road so fast that he created a scroll of paper so he didn't have to keep replacing paper in his typewriter, so that he could just sit and type constantly. And it's probably true that much of his angst about this and much of what was driving him in 1951 to type but not write, as Capote said, was probably amphetamines. He also wrote The Dharma Bums in 1958. These are two very important novels of this period, along with Naked Lunch. Then we get to the poets, Gregory Corso, author of Gasoline and Bomb. You can see a thread here in the 1950s. And his good friend, Allen Ginsberg, the most famous poet and the longest lived of all of these guys. Actually, Corso's still alive, but Ginsberg lived into the 1990s, and was justly famous for his poem Howl, about which a movie starring James Franco was made in the past few years. Howl was published by City Lights Press of San Francisco and was the subject of an anti-obscenity trial right after it was published, which the courts deemed it was not obscene because it did have redeeming social value, even though it talked about what we would consider today to be very adult themes, including drug use, interraciality, nightlife, homosexuality, and there's plenty of swearing in it. Well, let's look at a picture of the beats here. The most important, as you can see, I've labeled them. Burroughs, off on the far left, Kerouac above Cassidy. Cassidy figures in so many of these writings. He himself did not write. Cassidy was barely literate, but he was the icon of the beats and of later generations. He was the guy they modeled themselves on, the guy they were fascinated with, the guy who was living the life that they were trying to imitate and also write about. And then you see in the picture to the right, a very good shot of a very young Corso to the left and Ginsberg to the right. Okay, these guys and the people that were around them set up a literary genre called the beat. And this literary genre, along with the musical genre of folk and rock and roll, combined with the rebelliousness of the youth of the late 1950s to set into motion a cultural juggernaut that would become, when fueled by marijuana and LSD, as well as by New Left and anti-war ideology, would become the counterculture of the 1950s. And with that, I thank you for your attention.